Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're stepping into the world of architectural philosophy.
Oh, it's a fascinating field.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to explore this, how architecture can be seen as art and as design, obviously, but also as a practice.
And we have some great material to guide us today
We do.
from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about like what makes something architecture,
Mhm.
how we experience and judge buildings.
Yeah.
Even the ethical and social side of things, like is it okay to build a giant mansion when there's a housing shortage?
Definitely some tricky questions there.
So to start with, what is architecture? I mean, I found this quote by Cedric Price, this architect,
Yeah.
who said that architecture is what architects do.
Right, right.
Is it that straightforward?
Well, it sounds simple, but it gets complicated fast. I mean, the Stanford Encyclopedia really digs into this. You
Yeah.
know, it brings up all these key questions about how we even define architecture.
Like what?
Like, is everything an architect designs automatically architecture? Even if it's something purely functional,
Yeah.
like a warehouse.
Right, right. Yeah, like does it have to be art to be architecture?
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
You have these scholars called exclusivists.
Okay.
They argue that true architecture needs to have artistic intent,
Got it.
or at least some serious aesthetic refinement. Like a bus stop, for example, they might say, no matter how well designed, it's not really architecture.
Oh, interesting.
But then you have the inclusivists.
Okay.
They're like, any built structure, even something as simple as a park bench, is architecture because it involves design choices that affect how we experience it.
So like a spectrum.
Exactly.
But-
On one end, you have like the Taj Mahal.
Yeah.
And on the other end, maybe a really well-crafted birdhouse.
Okay, so where we draw that line has big implications, right?
Huge.
Yeah.
Especially when you start thinking about the ethical and social responsibilities of architects.
Right.
I mean, if a bus stop is architecture, should the designer think about its impact on the community, its sustainability,
That's a good point.
how it looks in the neighborhood?
Wow. Yeah. Suddenly feels a lot more significant. You never think about a bus stop like that.
Right. So defining architecture, it's not just some academic exercise. It shapes how we think about the built environment and the role of the people who design it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's talk about how we judge the quality of architecture then.
Sure.
I'm thinking about the Vitruvian triad. Beauty, structural integrity, and utility.
Ah, yes. The Vitruvian triad. Named after the Roman architect, Vitruvius,
Right.
it's been a cornerstone of architectural theory for centuries.
And he argued that any well-designed building needs all three of those things.
Okay. Exactly.
Okay, well, beauty's pretty straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
We want buildings to look nice. Structural integrity means it doesn't fall down, I'm guessing.
Right, exactly.
But what about utility?
Utility, in this context, it's about how well a building does its job.
Oh, okay. So like a library needs to function differently than, say, an opera house.
Exactly. Each building has its own unique set of needs, and the architect has to consider those.
Right. So it's about form and function, I guess.
Yeah.
But what happens when those clash? Can a building be beautiful but totally impractical?
Right.
Or super strong but ugly?
That's the dilemma architects face all the time. And it's why some argue that the Vitruvian triad, while helpful, might be too limited.
Okay.
Should we also consider things like sustainability? How a building impacts its environment.
Yeah.
Even its psychological effects on the people who use it. Some scholars say we need to expand the triad to include all those things.
So like you could build a giant concrete structure that's strong and maybe even kind of beautiful in a stark way. But if it ignores the surrounding ecosystem or makes life miserable for pedestrians, can we really call it good architecture?
Exactly. And that's why the debate about how we judge architecture is so crucial.
Right.
It pushes us to look beyond the surface and think about the building's role in a wider context.
I'm starting to see buildings so differently now. It's not just about how they look.
Right.
It's about understanding how form, function, and responsibility all come together.
And that brings us to another really fascinating aspect.
Okay.
How do we actually experience architecture? It's not just about looking at a building from the outside. We move through it, interact with it, we feel it with our senses.
Okay, yeah. Let's dive into that.
Yeah, it's not just what we see.
Right.
It's about how a building makes us feel.
You're right. It's like we all have that experience of walking into a space and just being blown away by it.
Right.
And it's not always about whether it's like conventionally beautiful or not. It's just like the way it's designed makes you feel something.
Yeah, exactly. Like walking into a grand cathedral, right? You've got those soaring ceilings, the light and shadow.
The echoes.
Exactly. It all creates a sense of awe.
Yeah.
Architecture is an art form we experience with our whole bodies, not just our eyes.
Okay, yeah. So architects, like, they actually think about that.
Oh, yeah. They think about it deeply.
Okay.
Using things like circulatory paths,
Okay.
spatial transitions to really design those experiences.
So they're choreographing an experience, almost like a dance.
Oh, I love that analogy. And it's not just the big picture either. It's the little details. Like, think about the textures of materials.
Oh, okay.
The roughness of brick, the smoothness of, like, polished concrete.
Oh, yeah.
Or the sounds, right?
Okay, yeah.
You hear the gentle splash of a fountain, maybe the rustle of leaves through an open window.
Oh, yeah. It's like a whole other dimension.
Even smells play a role.
Yeah.
Imagine a building with subtle hints of wood or incense. It just adds another layer to the whole experience.
I haven't really thought about it like that. It's like I usually just focus on the overall look of a building or the style, Yeah. But now I'm thinking about all these other little details that create the feeling.
And that brings us to a really crucial aspect of architectural philosophy, the ethical dimension.
Okay.
We've touched on it a little.
Yeah.
But I think it's worth exploring more deeply, this idea that building has moral implications.
That one's always kind of tripped me up.
Yeah.
Like, how can building something be ethical or unethical? Isn't it just bricks and mortar?
Well, that's where defining architecture gets even trickier, right? When we consider the social impact of buildings, then the architect's responsibility takes on a whole new meaning. For example, is it ethical to build a luxury condo tower when there's a shortage of affordable housing?
That's a good question.
Or design a building that's completely inaccessible to people with disabilities?
Right. It's not just about how it looks anymore.
Exactly.
It's about the real-world consequences.
And a lot of architects take this responsibility very seriously. There's a whole movement toward prioritizing these ethical considerations. Oh, yeah, like sustainable design, making sure buildings are accessible to everyone, finding solutions for affordable housing.
That's good to hear. But what about buildings that already exist? Right. Ones that maybe weren't designed with all this in mind.
Right. That leads us to this intriguing concept of architectural ghosts.
Architectural ghosts.
Think about ruins.
Okay.
Crumbling castles, abandoned factories.
Yeah.
They're not just physical structures, they're like echoes of the past,
Yeah.
Reminders of the people who built them and lived there.
Whoa, yeah. It's like they have a whole afterlife.
Right. And that raises all sorts of ethical questions. How do we preserve those echoes of the past?
Yeah.
Do we restore them or let them decay gracefully? And whose stories are we prioritizing?
Right.
The original builders, the people who lived there later, the community around it today?
This is deep. Architecture isn't just about creating something new.
It's not.
It's about our relationship with the past, our responsibility to the future, how we shape the spaces we live in.
Beautifully put. It highlights how architecture is always evolving.
Yeah.
Shaped by social, political, technological forces.
This deep dive's been incredible. We've covered so much, from just like the definition of architecture to the ethical questions it brings up.
It's a lot to unpack.
I feel like I have a whole new appreciation for buildings now. It really makes you think differently about the spaces we inhabit.
It does. And remember, it's an ongoing conversation, Architecture's always changing.
Yeah, reflecting what's going on in the world.
Exactly.
So for our listener, now that we've gone on this deep dive, what should they be paying attention to? How should they be looking at architecture differently?
Well, just keep your eyes open. You'll start to notice things you never saw before.
Like what kinds of things?
Oh, little things maybe, like how a building leads you through it, how the light changes at different times of day, how the different textures make you feel.
Yeah.
The subtle ways architects try to shape our experience.
I'm even thinking about my own house differently now. I never thought about like why the windows are where they are or how you move from one room to the next.
Exactly. And you'll start to understand the challenges architects face.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
Balancing aesthetics with practical needs, with their ethical responsibilities, with budget constraints, even the laws of physics.
There's a lot to juggle.
It really is.
Yeah.
It's like a giant puzzle, trying to create something beautiful that works, that has meaning, that's sustainable.
Wow.
And it's a puzzle that's never really solved, is it?
No, I guess not.
Each new building, each new generation of architects brings something new to the table, new ideas, new perspectives.
It's a living art form then.
I think so. Constantly pushing boundaries, changing and evolving.
So anyone who wants to learn more, where should they go?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a great place to start. They have tons of info on architectural philosophy, lots of links to other resources too.
Awesome. Well, this has been a fascinating journey. I have to admit, I didn't know much about this world before we started.
Well, neither.
But going from defining architecture to talking about the impact it has on our lives, even the ethical side of things,
It's complex.
it's been really eye-opening.
Definitely.
And to our listener, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of architectural philosophy. Hopefully you've got a whole new way of looking at the buildings around you.
Yeah, next time you walk into a building, really take it in.
Yeah.
Think about the choices the architect made, the stories that building holds, how it makes you feel, and how it affects the people around you.
It's amazing what you discover when you start paying attention.
It is.
Happy exploring, everyone.